There is a chapel in Ethiopia where one man guards the most sacred object on earth. No scientist, no priest, no head of state has ever been allowed inside to examine it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims this chapel holds the Ark of the Covenant, the original gold-covered chest described in the book of Exodus, built to hold the stone tablets Moses carried down from Mount Sinai. And for over 1,000 years, Ethiopia has said they have it. Aksum was once the capital of one of the 4 great empires of the ancient world. At its height, the Aksumite Empire controlled trade routes stretching from the Red Sea to the Nile. Roman writers called Aksum one of the 4 great kingdoms alongside Rome, Persia, and China. They minted their own gold coins. They built monuments taller than Egyptian obelisks. Their port at Adulis connected them to every major civilization in the ancient world. Glass from Rome, spices from India, ivory heading north to the Mediterranean. This was not an isolated kingdom. It was a crossroads. The connection between Ethiopia and ancient Israel is not modern invention. The Kebra Nagast, written in the 14th century, claims the ark was brought by Menelik I. Menelik, they say, was the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to the tradition, he visited Jerusalem and he brought the ark back to Ethiopia. That story has shaped Ethiopian national identity for 700 years. Every Ethiopian Orthodox church contains a tablet, a replica of the tablets. But science has never been allowed to verify the central claim. The guardian of the ark is a single monk appointed for life. He never leaves the chapel. When he dies, a successor is chosen. The object inside stays hidden. No photograph of the interior has ever been published. No sample has been taken. In 1945, Edward Ullendorf claimed he had seen the ark during the Italian occupation. He described it as a wooden slab, not the gold-covered chest described in Exodus. The Ethiopian church rejected his account entirely. They still do. So if no one can test the object itself, what can science actually examine? The answer is everything around it. Archaeologists have excavated Aksum for decades. The site tells a story independent of the relic. The earliest monumental construction at Aksum dates to around the 4th century BCE. By the 1st century CE, Aksum had become a major trading empire. Roman coins, Indian spices, and South Arabian inscriptions have all been found at the site. The question is whether this empire had a genuine connection to ancient Israel. The earliest written records at Aksum use a script derived from South Arabian languages. Some scholars argue these inscriptions show direct contact with the ancient Near East. But contact with the Near East is not the same as contact with Jerusalem. In 2012, a team of geneticists tested DNA from the Beta Israel community. The Beta Israel are Ethiopian Jews who practiced Judaism for centuries in isolation. The DNA showed a genuine Near Eastern genetic component, approximately 40% of their ancestry. This component was consistent with ancient Levantine populations, not modern admixture. The researchers used genome-wide single nucleotide polymorphism arrays to test ancestry. More than 600,000 genetic markers were analyzed per individual. The Near Eastern component was not evenly distributed. Populations in the northern highlands carried significantly more than those in the south. The gradient followed the same geographic pattern as the spread of Semitic languages in Ethiopia. Language, genetics, and religion all pointed north toward the Levant. The split between the Near Eastern and African components was estimated at roughly 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago puts the admixture, right, in the era of Solomon. At Yeha, about 50 kilometers from Aksum, archaeologists found a temple dating to the 8th century BCE. The construction technique matches South Arabian temple architecture almost exactly. Some researchers have argued these temples represent a direct cultural migration from the Arabian Peninsula. The distance across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is only 30 kilometers. Ancient sailors crossed it routinely. Ships carrying frankincense and myrrh crossed this strait for thousands of years. The trade routes did not just carry goods, they carried people, languages, and beliefs. Among the artifacts found at Aksum are incense altars identical to those in ancient Yemen. The material culture proves the connection. But what about the genetics? In 2012, a team answered that question directly. But a cultural connection does not prove that a specific object traveled this route. The archaeological dating of the chapel itself raises serious questions. And thus critical permeable bastards. The current Chapel of the Tablet was built in the 1950s. Emperor Haile Selassie ordered its construction to house the Ark in a purpose-built structure. Before that, the Ark was reportedly kept in the old church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. That church dates to the 4th century CE, when King Ezana converted to Christianity. Ezana's inscription is one of the earliest records of Christian conversion in Africa. But there is a gap of nearly 1,000 years between the temple's destruction and Ezana's reign. No inscription at Aksum from the 4th century mentions the Ark. The first written reference to the Ark being in Ethiopia appears in the Kibra Nagast, compiled around 1320. That is more than 2,000 years after the Ark was supposedly built. Some scholars have argued the Kibra Nagast was written to legitimize the Solomonic dynasty's claim to power. The dynasty needed a divine origin story. The Ark provided one. Historians have debated the Kibra Nagast's reliability for over a century. Some argue it preserves genuine oral traditions dating back 2,000 years. Others see it purely as political propaganda designed to consolidate power. The Solomonic dynasty used the Ark claim to legitimize their rule for 7 centuries. Without the Ark, there was no divine mandate. Without Solomon, there was no dynasty. But that does not mean the story is entirely fiction. In 2020, geneticists published a comprehensive study of Ethiopian population structure. They analyzed DNA from more than 300 individuals across dozens of ethnic groups. The results confirmed the Near Eastern ancestry component in multiple Ethiopian populations, not just the Beta Israel, Amhara, Tigrinya, and other northern Ethiopian groups. All carry it. The admixture is not random. It correlates with the Ethiopian highlands, where the Ark tradition is strongest. The dating estimates converge on a period roughly 3,000 years ago. That window overlaps with the biblical accounts of Solomon's reign. But overlap is not proof. Correlation does not establish that a specific object made the journey. What the genetics prove is that people moved between the Near East and Ethiopia in the right time period. What the archaeology proves is that they brought their building techniques with them. And what the inscriptions prove is that religious practices traveled along the same trade routes. None of this proves the Ark is in Aksum, but it proves the story is not impossible. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. The archaeological record shows that Aksum had the connections, the wealth, and the infrastructure. The genetic record shows that people from the Levant lived in this region during the right centuries. And the religious record shows traditions that predate Christianity in Ethiopia by centuries. The Beta Israel practiced animal sacrifice and observed dietary laws identical to ancient Israelite practice. These were not borrowed from later Christian missionaries. They appear to be independently preserved. The Beta Israel observed Shabbat, kept kosher dietary laws, and practiced ritual purity immersion. Their religious calendar followed ancient Israelite festivals that differ from Rabbinic Judaism. They had no knowledge of the Talmud. Their Torah was written in Ge'ez, not Hebrew. This isolation suggested their traditions split from mainstream Judaism before the Rabbinic period, before the 2nd century CE. Possibly much earlier. If the religious traditions are that old, the cultural connection to ancient Israel is genuine. The genetic and cultural evidence points in the same direction. But without access to the object itself, the case remains circumstantial. And circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, cannot replace physical examination. Tudor Parfit, the scholar who authenticated the Lemba tribe's priestly DNA, visited Aksum in the 1990s. He concluded that the Ethiopian claim was the most credible of all competing Ark traditions worldwide, more credible than Jordan, more credible than Southern Africa, more credible than France. But credibility is not the same thing as proof. And that is the central tension of the entire Ark story. Science can authenticate what it can touch. It cannot authenticate what it is forbidden to examine. An X-ray fluorescence test could determine if the object contains gold consistent with ancient Levantine metalwork. A radiocarbon test on any organic material could provide a date range. A wood species analysis could confirm whether the acacia wood described in Exodus matches the object. Every one of these tests is non-destructive. None would damage the object. Portable spectrometry can now analyze an object without touching it. A three-dimensional laser scan could map the object's form without any physical contact. Infrared thermography could detect whether the wood matches known ancient construction techniques. None of these techniques require removing even a single particle from the object. The technology exists. The only thing missing is permission. But the Ethiopian Church has refused every request, and they show no sign of changing. The guardian monks have said the Ark's power makes testing unnecessary. Faith, they argue, requires no verification, and the sacred requires no proof. For the faithful, the question is already answered. For science, it remains the most tantalizing untested claim in archaeology. Aksum has guarded this secret for longer than most nations have existed. One small chapel, one monk, one claim that has shaped an entire civilization. The Lemba tribe's priestly DNA was dismissed for decades before science confirmed it. The Dead Sea Scrolls were called forgeries before carbon dating proved their age. Science has a way of catching up to claims that seem impossible. But it can only catch up when it is allowed through the door. The genetics prove the connection existed. The archaeology proves the infrastructure existed. The trade routes were real. The migrations were real. The religious practices were ancient and independently preserved. But one locked door stands between the most famous lost relic in human history and the science that could authenticate it. Until that door opens, the Ark remains what it has been for 3,000 years. A story that everyone knows and no one can prove. If you want to know what happens when science finally does test a sacred relic, watch the next episode. Because not every church says no, and not every test confirms what the faithful expect.